Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm afraid I'm not that radical and different in the sense that I'm teaching at a business school for already 18 years approximately. So my background was in something entirely different, which was social sciences. And my publications, strangely enough, are sometimes in the area of natural sciences. So it's more of a mix. And I would say ecodemocracy and eco-justice, such topics, it's one of those pet projects of mine. Pretty big pet, but nonetheless. This is not what I teach in my business school. What I teach is pretty conventional, which is about circular economy, sustainable business, business ethics, etc., etc. So what's interesting about it, though, is that I think within each and every business school, you always have the discussion of the same good old SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. And one of the things that we do within our school, or at least I try to, is to place certain question marks by certain concepts that are assumed to be good. And hegemonic tendencies to actually embrace something without questioning it. So I guess, in a way, when one says radical, one of the ideas is to take a concept that is common concept and ask certain critical questions about it. And typically, we can teach students, or at least we are trying to, to do that. So if you have those questions, for me, already during the presentation at any stage, do ask, because that's what makes me as a lecturer sharper as well. Right. So today we're going to talk a bit about a case study in Nigeria, and that is related to research that we've just published a few months ago with my two Nigerian colleagues. One of them, Fatsuma, she works at University of Lagos at biology faculty. Naziru Mohammed, he works as a practitioner, as a wildlife guard in a park called Yankari. And this is where the fieldwork comes from. This is an ugly picture, and I'm just going to go away from it. We all know that there are issues with conservation, perhaps, so if we don't know, then just very briefly, if you look at, I'm not sure, I have it in my slides, I might not have updated them to this point, but basically, okay, just forget about this text for a while. If you present a picture of biomass on this earth, biomass of living beings. So if you present this biomass picture, let's say comparatively 100 years ago and now, what you see is that right now something about 70% of the entire biomass consists not of us humans, but of cattle, more or less, you know. Basically, it's cows, pigs, and whatever we eat. And then you have a bunch that belongs actually to us, humans. And then you have 4%, to be very specific, about 4% that is wild nature. Now, 100 years ago, it was more like 70% wild nature, and the rest of it is humans and other stuff that we eat. So that in itself is already, to me, a starting point of speaking about what conservation could be about, and it's conserving or protecting the remaining 4%. Okay, there are different schools in conservation. Some of them actually come from social sciences, and this is again where this kind of interdisciplinary perspective is important to understand, because it's not just conservation scientists, conservation biologists that are involved in it, but it could be also people coming from ethics or philosophy background, social sciences, and policy making, and business, especially business concerned with things like tourism and ecotourism, etc., etc. Why is everybody interested in that? Because wild nature, whatever is left of it, is big money. The more scarce it becomes from a business perspective again, well, the more interesting and fascinating. And also it sells. You know, if you have only one rhino somewhere, of course you want to see it. It's just like with dinosaurs who died out, and hey, here's a new thing. A species we have walking now, which will become a dinosaur in 10 years, so you can still see it alive. Okay, so anyway, new conservation, Marvi and Kareva, Levin and Emma Maris writing about Rabunctious garden, the kind of combination of human interests, market interests, economics, so including things like tourism, for example, and conservation of nature, kind of win-win scenarios in which protection involves having those market mechanisms in which indeed preserving biodiversity also means good news for, let's say, pharmaceutical industry. You derive all kind of great chemical things from plants. Great for ecotourism, you know, it employs people as well, so good for jobs, etc., etc. Critical social science, people like Dan Brockingham and Elizabeth Duffy, these guys, Busher and especially Robert Fletcher, they're here in the Netherlands, they're Americans or German-American. Anyway, what these critical social scientists do is they are particularly concerned with social inequalities and social justice. They say that conservation of nature should be only considered if it has a positive outcome for especially poor, liminal, marginalized, etc., people. Also, they love to talk about neocolonialism and how colonial powers have, you know, created the kind of environmental movement we have now, and they are reifying it and they are glorifying it, and actually it's part of the capitalist enterprise, and they are extremely critical actually of the whole enterprise of conservation, ironically, while they write themselves about conservation. Then you have so-called ecocentric conservation, and this is an old school, old kind, you'd say, that recognizes intrinsic value and just says, what are we doing? Actually, there are these hundreds, thousands of species right now endangered, and it's not about economic benefits, and it's not about benefits to disadvantaged communities which belong to one single species of humans. It's still, you know, these guys think in terms of inequalities within one species. These guys think about inequalities between species and say that we as humans love to talk about justice and discrimination, but somehow we are completely and utterly focused upon discrimination and injustice within our own species. We don't recognize that we discriminate against other species to the point of complete extermination, because we erase their habitats, if they're wild ones, and we, if you use a very kind of loaded term, enslave others in industrial animal production system. So, and then you have this so-called half-Earth vision, and that's the kind of thing that we were exploring in our research, in our article. So the late Edward O. Wilson, a pretty famous biologist, he popularized the term, but the term itself was not invented by him. It was actually invented by a bunch of people, especially Noss. And then there were others, such as Eric Dinerstein, that published about it. The idea is such that to preserve biodiversity the way it has been even in the 19th century, the baseline is not even that long ago. You know, you can think about, you know, now there are 8 billion of us. In the 19th century, there were less than 1 billion people on Earth. Conversion of habitats into productive industrial or especially agricultural areas hasn't started yet. So to protect those and these, you know, 4%, we need more or less half of the Earth's surface for conservation. It doesn't mean that humans are going to be moved to half, you know, it doesn't mean that there are walls or whatever being built. It means that we really have to think about sharing and really sharing. Not as we're sharing with cows, you know, the same space, because, yeah, well, you share and then you eat them. But basically in a much more profound way, you know. And what kind of profound way it is, I mean, just to start, in conservation literature, there's also a whole debate about what's actually happening on the ground. And what's happening on the ground in biodiverse areas, which happen to be tropical areas, yeah, you have all kinds of issues going on. You have poverty, you have indeed the need for conversion of habitats into this food growing areas. You have the clearing of land due to logging, due to mining. You have chemical contamination, you have tourism, you have oil palm plantations. And then on the margin of it, you have the poor marginal communities that are indeed pushed out of any kind of economic advantages and resort to bushmeat hunting. And bushmeat hunting results in many cases, because the forests are already largely unnatured, in so-called empty forest symptom, in which there's not much left to hunt, which obviously will further impoverish them. So what we were looking at was some literature on what happens in some of those areas, and especially because my colleagues come from Nigeria, they were specifically looking into Nigerian context and the idea of those human-wildlife conflicts, and the idea of basically looking at how do you share, how do you have that peaceful coexistence in ethical terms and also in pragmatic terms. Ethics being based on the idea of ecocentrism, or centered on ecosystems, for example, rather than anthropocentric, so human-centered. But also, obviously, well, perhaps not obvious, without disadvantaging human communities as well. Some could say this is a bit of a have your cake and eat it too, because sometimes what you also realize, the more you read, the more you understand, and the more you travel with your field work too, sometimes you have to make hard choices. It can be both. You increase, let's say, wages, which normally increases consumption, and for example, you have things like economic growth, and that growth, if it's based on consumption of natural resources, it's quite hard to reconcile with actually preserving those resources. And sometimes some sacrifices might be needed, but then the question is to what end, and who and how, and is it again the marginal human communities that are being sacrificed? There's again the wild habitats that are being sacrificed. So basically we wanted to look at it from the point of view of communities themselves, especially the ones living next to the area that Naziru, my colleague, is patrolling, so to speak. So that Yankari Game Reserve, which is known as a national park, but just think about it, just the name of it already, a game reserve. So there's another issue coming into play here. You've heard about trophy hunting, perhaps, and the whole complex thing. Or perhaps you haven't. I don't know of your background. So again, you know, if I were to talk to my business students, I would actually assume they wouldn't know the background, which is fine. If you are interested in conservation and also read, well, there are some leading journals in science, which are called Science and Nature. In these two journals, they did publish a thing on trophy hunting, and there was a very hot debate about it just about 3 years ago, nasty debate. Basically, Amy Dixon, I think was her name, published something in support of trophy hunting, saying that otherwise, basically, those marginal poor communities do not profit from things, and also it's the only way to finance these things. So without it, again, the poor communities will not profit, and also conservation might not work. And then there was also an avalanche of, reacting back, because like, what kind of signal are we sending? All kind of funny, well, not that funny. 10 years ago, Cecil the lion, perhaps you've heard, some rich American dentist, shoots that iconic white lion, whatever, an outcry, fat dentist Americans shooting our wildlife. And then basically 2 African governments say, we need those fat American dentists, we need their money, otherwise we're not going to protect the lions, we're shooting them ourselves, because otherwise they're eating the cattle of the Maasai, for example, in Kenya. Ugly, nasty stuff, by the way, in terms of rhetoric, etc., going on. So basically the idea was, in this case, just talk to local communities who live next to, or actually on the territory. That's a tricky part, because those nature reserves are not supposed to have any kind of cattle farming, any kind of agriculture happening on the territory. It's supposed to be protected. Well, it isn't. They live in many places which are not supposed to be actually farmed, etc. But talk to them and try to find out what do they think about wildlife, how do they see the idea of peaceful coexistence, sharing, how do they see the issue of human-wildlife conflict, things like trophy hunting, where do they think they can derive not profit but livelihoods from, and can they see a synergy between protecting wildlife and their own future. So basically this is the area, and again what's remarkable about it, some areas are supposed to be entirely protected. There's also quite a bit of logging going on, by the way, which is legal logging, because if the government wants to log, well, they just do. Then there was this messy situation, well, perhaps you've all heard about Boko Haram, right, a terrorist organization. Well, there are more groups like this. There are also certain takeovers by groups that trade in drugs as well as do human trafficking. Anyway, some of them infiltrated one of the areas just during field work. It became actually unsafe for my colleagues to do so. They had to withdraw. So it's not a very neat map, because some areas could not be approached as easily. But yeah, basically all kind of interesting things coming out of it. And so if you consider who lives there, aside from local communities, so you have the big 5. These are the big attractions for tourists, obviously. Not to shoot them, but to look at them, and to shoot them sometimes. So elephants, lions, etc. Also you have warthogs, baboons. You have those patas monkeys, and actually that patas monkeys is something that Fatsuma, my co-author from Lagos, specializes in so-called Mona monkeys. Well, maybe I shouldn't bore you about like the differences between these primates, but basically it's a very biodiversity-rich region. And when you ask people, so what kind of animals do you actually like as far as exploring the attitudes, and what kind of animals would you like to, share your place with, and what do you want to do in case there's something like crop raiding, which was a big issue at the time, especially with elephants passing through. The thing is, a lot of territories where elephants pass through used to be traditional migration grounds of elephants. So there are fields now, and what happens is that elephants trample upon fields, and in some cases you also have literally violent conflict, especially if certain weapons are being used, elephants try to retaliate. So yeah, the idea was to ask what kind of animals do they think they could let pass through, and under which conditions, basically. Oops. Right. So here on the picture, you actually see Naziru doing the actual interviews. Maybe it's a bit blurry. not very clear. He was mostly talking to the village elders. By the way, now we've got a bit more money for following up talks. So also right now they're talking to even more community members, including women. In this particular sample, they were just talking to the elders in just 4 villages. So the sample has extended still. What comes out of it generally? I mean, it was pretty full-on questionnaire with a lot of things you cannot see, because even I cannot see it if I look very closely. Very silly to put it in the presentation, sorry for that. But we were asking all kinds of theoretical questions, like what would you do if, or what would you like if, for example, an elephant comes into your territory. You have to realize that these community members, most of them were illiterate. They know nothing about like this conservation literature, nothing about those debates. They know nothing about, well, as we found out, the larger issue of, let's say, biodiversity loss. Basically, it's very much about their livelihoods and about how they grew up and their interaction with the natural world. So, yes, they appeared, generally speaking, and this is again summarizing, very much open to dialogue about it, because they found it a very interesting topic in general. Animals is something that they interact with daily. You also have domestic animals there, and obviously animals that are seen as pests. So there would be typical predators, for example, such as lions, and elephants that again cause crop damage. It is something they deal with, and because of especially Chinese syndicates that, as you might know, Chinese traditional medicine uses some animal parts. Most of these come from Africa, etc. There's so much money involved into wildlife trade, it's staggering. I mean, some of the poachers, it's not... That's very important to remember, by the way. Part of it is impoverished villages. Part of it is helicopters, which are military helicopters or tanks moving in, because the kind of money that goes into harvesting wildlife, especially as it becomes scarce and more protected, yeah, it is quite scary in a way. On Netflix, there's a movie, by the way, called Virunga. I think for about a decade already it's there. But yeah, you know, this is a Congo case study, but there's a lot of, it's basically practically war on the ground type of thing, you know. Lots of money going into this, and then the NGOs, Western NGOs especially, that do have money and coming up with all kind of ideas and mechanisms how to buffer the zone. But again, you know, for our local community members, what they see is what affects them obviously in their locale, and sometimes they saw same wildlife as a dream upon which you can become miraculously rich. And then they would tell stories about how this person killed an elephant, sold it very smartly, not as one elephant, but, you know, chopped it in little different parts, sold it to this Chinese, let's say, a supplier, then sold to this, and all kind of interesting ways to make even more money about it. And then somebody else said, but look, if you kill this elephant, and we're talking about the same community sitting around the same place, that, but look, if you kill that elephant, then tourists are not going to come, and what are you going to show that elephant? Sometimes these discussions, by the way, that was very interesting to see, took place within one family, and the idea was that also what surprised us perhaps as, well, not us, me as a Westerner, although I have done a bit of field work in Africa prior to that, but just how hierarchical things used to be. So, for example, if the elder was present, then nobody would speak against whatever was said. When the elder was gone, sometimes something would be whispered that was completely different. And again, you know, kind of complicated relations between, the village does not think as a village. I mean, there are obviously individuals, just like in every community. Still, culture could actually influence the way that they would perceive it. So there was quite a lot of, let's say, traditional knowledge about species, how species behave, and a lot of people knew quite a lot about behavior of elephants, for example. specifically. Actually, there were a few traditional ways of dealing with, let's say, for example, predators. So ways to scare them off without direct confrontation and without shooting them. So that was also interesting to hear. But then again, there was always this idea, look at the elders, what the elders are doing, or look at the park officials, or look at the local authorities, looking up to them, and whatever they dictate, they say we will do. So other factors affecting biodiversity, such as growing population, I mean, that is not in the field vision at all, because, well, you know, you have your kids, and you don't think, just like we don't think in the West, what it actually means, perhaps. So the idea of half Earth obviously was never heard of, but the idea of sharing, obviously, or perhaps not so obviously, has been. So just this answer to the questions about, well, I mean, some of the questions here were very simple, like what kind of animals do you like? Why do you like them? What kind of animals you don't like? And that was indeed something that originated quite a lot of discussion. And what kind of animals would you tolerate or not kill, and why would you not kill them? It was literally at this pretty... We had a different questionnaire first. It was all very academic and nobody understood a thing. And Naziru could not really translate it, so we had to come up with this alternative. So, yeah, this leads me to a larger discussion and perhaps this idea of going back to eco-democracy and ethics. So, community opinions themselves also did indicate, just like in animistic religions that were known to be in the area, various degrees. And my own training in anthropology, suddenly I actually started reading books that I haven't opened for 25 years about a certain groups of people that lived there. And the idea of, for example, your ancestors, their spirits live through those animals, and the kind of cosmology of the world in which animals are very much integrated in human worlds. And indeed, they do see themselves holistically as part of that nature, not just as lip service, but, I mean, something that they literally believe, that there's almost a kind of reincarnation involved in it. Well, that was given way more and more, apparently, to, you can call it maybe westernized or colonialism of the mind, perhaps what Vandana Shiva would call, ideas of, well, they're natural resources. It's like with ecosystem services and natural resources, animals are also resources, and these are means for getting money, to be put this way. But then next to it, again, there were people that still the kind of resonance of those more traditional, non-anthropocentric ways, perhaps, of looking at animals still resurfaced. Which brings us to this question of ethics and the kind of discussion about neoliberalism, anthropocentrism, etc., etc. So, yeah, some of the tougher questions, as I said, some of the work done within the field of conservation, it borders on politically incorrect, or at least you are really treading along certain areas. We just had a discussion beforehand and discussed the idea of a noble savage, for example, and things that having to do with indigenous rights. And if in every instance you think that indigenous rights intrinsically, whatever members of communities might do, are more important than, let's say, lives or habitats or lives of non-humans, that does bring back certain ideas that, again, can be criticized. And it's interesting looking at the literature of especially those critical social scientists, that just the kind of thing that some conservationists get back as far as criticism is concerned, you do not think about those poor communities. If they need money, then this is we are just too privileged to even understand. And we are talking about all these animals, but what we should be really thinking about is inequality that creates it, and the kind of capitalist system. I have to add that during the discussion just now, we also discussed the fact that it's not capitalism. I come from the worst country in the world, by the way, at the moment, and actually probably in the past too, and it was not a capitalist country. It was a socialist country. Look at also countries like Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and China, nominally, communist countries, social. It's no different as far as, dissemination of environment and huge things. As long as nature is seen as a resource, and as long as extractive industries are not controlled, whether they are controlled by the government, but government still doesn't care about the outcome as long as money is made, then I don't think it's necessarily capitalism. It's just the system of extraction, industrialism, and indeed expansion. So in that regard, too, an interesting question, again, a moral question about basically colonialism, and we are all familiar with it from a human point of view. But in this case, one of the people that wrote about it, Tariq Bodazing, he wrote about colonialism in terms of our human oppression of non-human species. And also he looked at the African case study and indeed said what is happening now is very similar to kind of time when slaves were extracted from a continent, and indeed touching upon certain issues that could be quite controversial, perhaps, in this regard, especially because in this case you're not applying it to humans anymore, but basically speaking about us humans colonizing the earth. So, yeah, and that in itself, it's not just about ethics, emerging ethical and legal framings of non-human rights, because we know what the idea of human rights is. We have an international court, obviously, here in The Hague. We know that there are violations of human rights and there are certain ways of addressing them. If we were to think of nature rights, non-human rights, animal rights, for example, as having any kind of political and legal weight, that might actually change quite a lot of things, also in terms of extraction industries, but also things like hunting, for example, etc. And yeah, this again leads to pretty tough questions, such as, indeed, when we're looking at those marginal communities. Can poverty reduction be decoupled from economic growth and increase in consumption of natural resources? So if you're looking at SDGs, I'm going back to this Sustainable Development Goals, economic growth is oftentimes used as a mechanism for actually addressing those problems. So you need more economic growth, and then somehow the idea is that rising tide lifts all boats. If you have a lot of money around, it will trickle down to the poorest, for example. I'm simplifying things, but basically, yeah. And then when you have economic growth, you have scientific progress, you have technological progress, so you can make things like wind turbines, solar panels, etc., and therefore you solve climate change. While in more critical literature, and I wouldn't call it radical, but just critical, it just says, yep, there we go, oxymoron, can't have your cake and eat it too. Very difficult to decouple consumption from those natural resources. I mean, you can transit to services from manufacturing to a certain degree, and that's what we talk about in the business school in the context of circular economy. But not everything. You cannot decouple food. There are 8 billion of us, and we all eat just like apex predators, or quite large in biological terms, omnivores. Even I was just telling to my colleagues here a few days ago, I was in a vegan restaurant with friends, and there was quinoa, which comes from, South America. There was avocado. If you know how avocado is grown, it's rather problematic. There were all kind of interesting things that were flown all over the world, and just thinking, even if you're extremely conscious, unless you really put yourself in a box and you're not just vegan, but you only eat local things that you yourself grow on the roof of your own house somehow, yeah, it's kind of hard to say that this can be made circular. Because circularity also means that whatever comes in can come out again and can be reused. It can be done with electronics. You know, some parts of my phone might contain things like zinc or even valuable metals like iridium. Sure, it's very good to keep them. And you can reuse them without downcycling anything. But things like food, once you've eaten it, it ends up in the toilet and it's just not the same quality as what you've put in your mouth. So there are limitations to that circular economy too. There are limitations as to how one can have a lifestyle such as mine with a huge carbon footprint, I must say. And that is to say that I am kind of feeling bad about it. But, you know, I think too, you know, one of the big questions here too is that what is poverty, and part of poverty, as we've discussed also a while ago, is it's not just about material resources, but it's about being integrated in a community, having health, having support, having some kind of system upon which you can fall back. So that does not necessarily come from material goods. But some of it does come from material goods, and that's a tougher question. Again, you cannot decouple food, for example, or clothes, because they also fall apart. You know, you can have some kind of recycling facility for old fabrics, but at some stage you're downcycling too. You need electricity, you need water to actually make it into a new garment, and it will be of lower quality, so slowly it is not as good as what you've had originally. So if the alternative path to economic development cannot be found, how can raising the standard of the living for developing countries' people avoid potentially catastrophic impacts for global ecosystems? And yeah, I do find this is a tough one. It's like I don't think there's any kind of straightforward answer to it. And I hear a lot, especially in social science circles, the critique of capitalism and the fact that the rich consume so much more than the poor. But then again, interestingly enough, that normally communities that live to biodiverse areas, meat consumption is actually quite high. If you map traditional religions or cultures, such as Hinduism, and their consumption of meat, these days it's gone up, actually, unfortunately, in India, for example. But then again, you have pockets of vegetarianism, veganism appearing actually in developed countries. So I think just to have, you know, a very simple idea like, okay, these are the bad consumers right here, and then the innocent not consuming right there. And of course also the question of justice, because you can't just say, okay, these people don't consume much. They should have a right to consume like us, right? By definition, that would be also about that redistribution. But as I know, coming from my country, whenever redistribution happens, you remember the Occupy movement, the 99% versus 1%. In my country, bloody revolution, you kill the elites, you take away the wealth, you redistribute. Within 5 years, you have new elites. I'm kind of skeptical about it too. I'm definitely a leftist on my political spectrum still. But, you know, the experience of my own country, to me, there's something strange about it too. And I'm not sure that you can take away from whoever has accumulated wealth, and it's not just in a Western country. Think about middle classes in the same Argentina, India, and whatever else. Looking at statistics, these are growing middle classes too, without a bloody revolution. Because I don't see, aside from the taxation system, you know, that taxes the rich very much, how is that going to occur? So I do think, again, politically speaking, legally speaking, these are not the kind of easy questions to ask, even redistribution in itself on paper, because again, critical social science would say it's capitalism that is to blame. But what's the alternative? Is it really socialism? And then again, for the same good old biodiversity, I haven't seen much happening in socialist or communist countries that was much different from capitalist ones. So, and then here comes a more, eco-democracy related question. Since non-humans cannot speak for themselves, how can they have a voice in our democratic systems? And that is something that Party for Animals in this country, I think, is doing pretty nicely as far as an illustration is concerned. Basically, you have representatives. They're human representatives, and they, so to speak, like in the children's book, The Lorax, they speak for others, on behalf of others. You can call that anthropocentric as well, because obviously they're humans and they're representing somebody else. And how do we know? Again, there are questions why they mostly representing domestic animals. Well, maybe because in the Netherlands, the bulk of animals is indeed animals for consumption, so kind of logical. It's not even 4% biodiversity biomass in this country. It's probably about 1%. And they're mostly migratory birds that land in Vlieland and places like this, If a wolf crosses over from Germany, you notice that normally gets run over by some transport pretty quickly before the farmer even realizes that it might be a danger for the sheep. So that kind of representation is perhaps something that, looking at traditional political science theories, has indeed emerged, and especially within the more legal new science. And by the way, most of it came from animal rights, so not so much ecocentrism or nature rights point of view, already in the 70s. And then looking at issues that sometimes had to do with sentience, for example, ability to feel pain, or sometimes intelligence, or whatever you can call it, defined very much in human terms. And then obviously you have the whole hierarchy, like the higher apes or dogs or dolphins, for example, would have more value than something which is supposed to have less sentience, such as an earthworm. But then again, from this ecocentric perspective, it's those creepy, crawly creatures, at the bottom of the food chain that actually keep the ecosystems healthy and intact. So in that case, we can also think about representing those things. For me, I think one of the most important things is not even deciding are we representing cows, cats, and dogs and chickens? Are we representing earthworms or migratory birds, Canada geese? But just per se that we have an institution, political thing, somewhere that actually says democracy, coming from the word demos, meaning people, is for one single species only at present. And that in itself is disturbing because we're just one species out of many on this earth. So just to have any kind of idea of representation, whatever it is, for whoever it is and however it is, as a starting point, is indeed something that perhaps now, and especially indeed with this developing scholarship of also animal rights law, I didn't think it existed until a year ago when I actually came across a journal that specializes in animal law, and then thinking, wow, this really can go much further than this. And then the hypothetical questions, of course, do people need nature? Yes, obviously we do. We derive everything from it. Does nature need us? A bit of a mute question, or like hypothetical. Obviously, again, if we see ourselves as part of nature, then there are other creepy questions like other products of our labor, such as this computer and this table. I mean, obviously, this table, it's got some wood. Probably it came originally from nature. But is it still part of nature? Our whole entire environment. If we say that, then we can say, well, that's no problem. We're still, part of nature with all our interesting parking lots and extractive industries. But yeah, all these discussion points perhaps. Yeah, that was actually an interesting thing I've also just mentioned in the conversation, that the little thing I was invited to in quite a few years ago, in 2013, I was supposed to actually defend the position that justice for people should not come before justice for the environment. And I received a death threat prior to going to this, so it was kind of interesting. Betrayer of my own race. And by race, they meant human race. Probably some nutter. I don't think it's worth thinking about. But it does show, in a sense, that, you know, what I'm saying here, all these questions, it's perhaps not just... I mean, the good thing is that my work gets read. I thought then, at least, you know, it creates some controversy, while it's not exactly the kind of reaction that I normally would expect, especially I don't publish anything too revolutionary as far as I thought. It was just supposed to be a televised debate at Manchester University. But yeah, interesting thing is that for this particular debate, the debate was actually won by those who said that justice for people cannot come before justice for the environment because it's completely intertwined systems. We are dependent on the environment. We are, at a fundamental way, very much part of it as biological creatures. All kind of rhetoric devices that led to it, which, by the way, made me think I should not contact the police or whatever, and I should just let it go as long as I don't hear from this person again, because I'm just too happy that it all ended well. But yeah, again, it shows perhaps that some of those questions are pretty confrontational. And indeed, why do we keep focusing on one single primate and differences between that primate and not looking at any others? And indeed, just looking at sheer numbers, just numbers, orangutans in the wild, chimps in the wild, gorillas in the wild. We're talking a few thousand in the whole wide world. In the zoos, many more, of course, but that's it. That's all that we manage to preserve right now. And even that, again, watch Virunga on Netflix, even that is largely endangered. So, again, how to address things. One could be political, eco-representatives, another are economic things. We do discuss it within the business school. There are pros and cons of commodification. So this RED program, basically UN paying for not cutting trees, to put it very simply in a nutshell. PES, so again, payment for ecosystem services. Economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. You know, it's a complicated thing again, because in some way, obviously, this is not about intrinsic value. However, it does have a very direct bearing upon something, how the world perhaps works, for better or worse these days. If you do attach a price to a habitat, wild habitat, and it can be just very simply thinking about ecotourism, for example. And indeed, that live elephant, just as one of the villagers now interviews said, brings in more money in the long term, not even in the long term, in the already next few years term, than the dead elephant, chopped for different parts. Well, that in itself, for better or worse, might already create and does already create an incentive sometimes for protection. When local communities see that there are certain things that they can do and indeed be involved and yet get money without culling, what's called, or basically killing, well, sometimes that very much works as well. So things also, pros and cons of community ownership of national parks, co-creation, all these ideas. Well, again, it depends on the context. In some cases, communities were known to be allocated part of the park, sold it to poachers right away. Deforested right away. In other areas, not at all. Very much contextual, very much depends. Sometimes also it's very individual. In certain countries, well, within these communities, as I say, within families, sometimes you had divisions. Father would say, chop the tree, make the money. Son would say, no, don't chop the tree. We actually have some beehive there. We take a little bit of honey and we can continue doing that. It's a good thing. You know, but basically, yeah, these days, for better or worse, the question of money and how it's attached to this biodiversity conservation does very much come to the fore. Especially if you think about big organizations, such as the ones behind REDD, for example. Yeah, what I do find interesting too is that looking at various individuals globally, and again, coming from anthropology, that's how I've started, within Asia, within Africa, within South America, you do see that there's love of nature and proactive attitudes towards not just individual animals, but sometimes entire habitats, coming from all kinds of corners. And also sometimes some of these individuals pay the highest price. The number of people killed in South America last year, the ones that were protesting against extractive industries, sometimes part of the same village from which the same loggers or miners would come from, was staggering. You have a website called The Global Witness, so they look at those cases. We're talking about almost 300 recorded cases, but apparently unrecorded 1,000. And we're talking about violent murders. Same happens in many African countries as well. My own work centered for a while also in Cambodia. So Chatwati was one of those martyr cases. Many of those cases, by the way, are never solved because, yes, somebody gets killed, there's no investigation, the government is not interested normally. Some other environmental activists went very far indeed. This one, Wangari Maathai, got a Nobel Prize for her work. And, you know, Million Trees, Plenty initiatives, I'm sure you've heard about it. But, and again, activists, scientists, activists, analysts, such as Vandana Shiva, again, working together with local communities, especially in India, in her native country, but many other places. And basically, yeah, deriving her inspiration not from her own Western education, but perhaps from her humbler roots. Yeah, what she said, perhaps you can see it small print, cutting down forests or converting natural forests into monocultures. She also developed the concept monocultures of the mind, by the way, but in this case, physical monocultures. For industrial raw material generates revenues and growth. But this growth is based on robbing the forest of its biodiversity and forest communities of their sources of food, fodder, fuel, fiber, medicine, and security from floods and drought. Which is, by the way, still remarkable. I mean, you see the irony in this, because this is also anthropocentric. So you see local communities, food, medicine, fodder, and then you think, what about biodiversity itself? But, okay, I mean, aside from this, this is, I think, one of those, again, rhetorical points when win-win can be seen. It's like you're saving nature, you're helping local communities, in the way it can be powerful. But yeah, I think when we talk about the rights of nature, and indeed this eco-democracy, it goes much further than this. It's no longer just about food. But it's about, well, what about the right of those non-human species to actually, what about their own food? And what about their own, you know, habitat? And it's interesting when we talk about indigenous communities, we talk about indigenous in the sense they live in the same place for a while. I mean, there's a debate about that too, like how do you get this, you know, if you grow up in France and then as far as you know, looking at your family tree, probably your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents haven't moved for generations. Are you indigenous or not? The point is that a lot of indigenous non-human communities have been there before human communities were there, like in Madagascar, you know, the big bird, for example. So the discussion of also indigenous non-humans is quite important here, especially when we talk about rights to land, because that's what quite a few of those discussions about rights, it's also about entitlements. It's about the right to be on this land and the right to use those resources. But what if we say that those non-humans have a right to be there and use those resources? So, okay, looping back from all this generic discussion back to the case of Nigeria. Thanks for being there, guys. This GF project, that's something that Naziro was involved in. I'm not going to tell you. But yeah, there was an interesting discussion emerging about compensation in a nutshell. So there was one of those pragmatic outcomes. So if an elephant raids your crops, what most people agreed on, they would tolerate it if they were compensated. Normally, for example, there was also a large NGO that would say, yes, we're compensating, we're paying this money. So when the elder was present during the interviews, they would all just sit there, yes. And then when the elder was gone, whispering, we never get the money. Sometimes money is appropriated, never trickles down at all. People who are doing hunting and overhunting, sometimes they're not the same that profit from, the development aid sometimes too. So there are also pretty tricky questions in terms of corruption or whatever you might want to call it, or this type of hierarchies. Another thing, of course, that emerges is it's an ethical issue. Paying for not killing. Is that good enough of a motivation, And what if you can't pay? With COVID, for example, a lot of those NGOs, especially Western ones, could not physically be there. And that gets even worse, because if you're not physically there, you're doing money transfer wiring. Then normally, what lots of them started doing, especially grassroots, they would just go around like with microfinance and literally give money to the villagers, sometimes when the elder wasn't looking. It also creates problems in itself too. But yeah, this was one of the big points of contention right there, because a simple consensus was, yeah, sure, if we get money for it, for not killing, then yeah, we all support it. And then indeed a bit of discussion of, okay, but what if you were involved in this ecotourism? How does that work? And, then again, the picture was a little bit tricky. And we started with this half Earth, and we trickled down to very kind of pragmatic, sort of down-to-earth discussion. So, yeah, beside the fact that paying for not killing by no means is something traditional, I mean, monetary economy was never part of animistic religions, and especially if you think that those killed animals are the souls of their ancestors. Right? I mean, what kind of strange idea is this now? But yeah, again, looking at some research, desk research, which looked at different case studies in different areas where compensation has been paid, it's a bit of a patchy thing. So in some cases it works. You might have heard about slaughter of dolphins that's been going on in actually for quite a few years now, precisely because the local community said we were not paid not to slaughter. So as a kind of protest, the dolphins were slaughtered. So pretty, horrible stuff. I mean, I've only seen it a few times and I decided not to look at it because we're talking about rivers of blood, literally. Just really horrible stuff. Faroe Islands. Okay, so poor farmers should be compensated for crop damage, but this process should be simultaneous with development of longer-term solutions. This was one of our biggest overarching ideas, also coming from literature. For example, it's not just ecotourism, but there are all kinds of initiatives having to do with, for example, non-intensive agriculture, growing food that is next to biodiversity, does not deplete it, nonetheless does provide you actually more diverse diet than if you were doing just monocultural plantations. And there's some funding for that too, actually. And ways forward. So Yeah, I think one of the biggest things coming out of it was just one word, education. And education at a number of levels, and I think that applies to our Western countries and very much at my business school as well. I mean, that's why I'm normally not just teaching, but I'm also publishing in the area of environmental education. Well, one of the interesting points about education is so-called sex education, what you also see in areas that fieldwork was done. So contraception, for example, is simply put not used much at all. In fact, quite a few of development agencies, fieldwork was done before COVID and then during COVID, but literally sometimes condoms and such would be dumped. But again, there are all kind of religious and social and cultural taboos against it. There are also sort of strange beliefs around it. One of them was Western conspiracy, just like with vaccinations, you know. So that in itself, you know, again, from an anthropological point of view, it's very important to understand what's actually happening there sometimes. What you also see is indeed higher mortality in places where you have things like child marriages, well, basically teenage pregnancies. Some of the individuals interviewed were 12 years old and already pregnant, for example. And again, you know, coming in just from a Western point of view, even let's forget about biodiversity and environment, but just kind of like feminism, Western feminism point of view, and say, oh my God, you know, a 12-year-old or 18-year-old already having 3 children, is it a matter of her choice? You know, is that culture? Was there something universally strange about human rights, women's rights, reproductive rights, etc.? Again, complicated questions, but indeed complete lack of sex education, complete lack of understanding in principle, like what's happening with those, what are these contraceptives for? And obviously also certain things, culturally speaking, it's good to have big families kind of idea. You know, if you have, I read some interesting research comparing Niger, which has the highest proportion of births, with Japan, and just the kind of opinions that parents had about, you know, what it is to have a child. They differ quite a lot. So one of the ideas would be, as it used to be actually, in the past, by the way, they did have contraceptive, actually quite a lot of contraceptive use, which was sort of nasty. It had to do with spontaneous abortions and things like that, but also all kind of herbal remedies. Because of the introduction by missionaries, it was all dismissed completely. So now you don't have missionaries, you have kind of strange combination of semi-Christian in one area and then semi-Muslim communities. Strange prohibitions coming from both basically our own Western, more Western religious prohibitions, and then indeed abandonment of their traditional things, and fear of modern contraceptive methods. And indeed the whole idea of feminism and like somebody being married at the age of 9, especially in those areas, was not really something to be discussed. Well, another thing about those improved equal education opportunities, obviously, and again, too small of a print, I'm sorry for this, it also meant that, I mean, there are different things that we said about education. One is basic numeracy and literacy, because that was just not there. A lot of people in that community, as I said, they're not just illiterate. The strange thing is schools sort of exist, forest schools in that area, and yet after 8 or 9 years also it appeared that many teachers were not exactly literate. But basically not much progress was made, which certainly diminishes their chances in the future to be part of any kind of knowledge economy, right? What they can do after that is basically the same thing, manual work, or still be very much dependent on the forest. So no alternatives are created. Another thing is, and we were using the case of roots and shoots, Goodall charity that looked at education in conservation itself, using the same local knowledge and basically having teachers that actually came from localities as well, reviving certain values through their own indigenous beliefs, let's put it this way, but also looking at modern conservation and indeed things like what is biodiversity and what are we actually facing now, plus education, what we have here also at business schools for things that might be good alternatives, and indeed knowledge economy could be one of them, or indeed being trained as an eco guide, which is, thank goodness, this is again something that affected the region Yankari very badly, the COVID period when no tourists came in, so the amount of bush meat taken out. And actually the wildlife trade was going just fine, which is very ironic, isn't it? Because if it is a zoonotic disease and did not come from the lab, and wet markets, etc., strangely it still went on big time, especially because there was no guardians to see. So education that would actually provide alternatives. Education that would also provide alternatives for the same better teachers, because what Naziru himself said, he was talking to a teacher and he had printed out questionnaire, and at some stage the teacher was teaching English. So the teacher could not even read the first question, which was, which animals do you like? That doesn't help, of course, because in this system you're just perpetuating things. It's like blind leading the blind. Funny enough, right now in Northumbria University we have this huge masters for 800 students. Most of them come from developing countries, I think after collapse of, after Brexit. No European students come, so England looks at its former colonies. Nigeria, Ghana, India, well, you also have students from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, etc. But yeah, what some of my Nigerian students said, actually I ended up sitting with 10 of them literally 2 days ago. They say, well, we don't go to those schools, we know about those schools, we go to private schools. And as I said, if you realize that these Nigerian students are paying £20,000 a year, including perhaps, oh sorry, this is my son and I'm going to click it away. Yeah, basically, if you think this is not your average student, in Nigeria that Naziru was talking to, these are individuals that come from very rich families and can basically afford this kind of thing. So education, again, it's a bit of a mixed bag. You also have very much local elites. You have growing middle classes, the type of education they're enjoying. Nigerian students that I have in my class, it's entirely different from what's happening here. So perhaps we can think about certain win-wins, indeed, as a way of solution, in which certain social objectives, social equality objectives, can be achieved, among other things, through education. And again, this Roots and Shoots program is very interesting in that regard, because it does offer also kind of placements, internships, in which the same students also start to lead certain tours, for example, educating tourists once again, and indeed fat American dentists and such, why Cecil the lion might be not something to shoot, but some other way might be more interesting to relate to it. But yeah, I think indeed in this regard, well, some of the literature, it's a lot of self-promotion, so I'm not going to show it. But yeah, most of it centers on the idea of education, some of it native, some of it going back to the indigenous values, some of it more Western. So yeah, that's a little research going on at the moment, and if any of you are interested, then do get in touch. I also do like to have collaborative projects, interdisciplinary projects, because as you see, this actually has nothing to do with my business school. So do get in touch, please.